Great. Okay, so thanks all for joining today. My name is Alexis Palmer-Flugog. I'm the Executive Director with the Mental Health and Climate Change Alliance. And I'm joining today from the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, known presently as Vancouver. Before we get started, I just want to mention again that the presentation will be recorded, and then you'll be able to find it on our website shortly after. And as many of you know, one of our mandates here at the MHCCA is to share knowledge and to build community around supporting mental health in the face of climate change. So Dr. Galway is a key figure in this area of research, and I'm so happy to have the opportunity to welcome Dr. Galway today to speak about her research and the community of practice that she's building. As a Canada Research Chair in Social-Ecological Health, Dr. Galway is studying and addressing the interconnected social and ecological determinants of health. She and her research team are using an interdisciplinary, place-based, and community-engaged approach to identifying how we can respond to climatic and environmental change in our communities to promote sustainability, health, and social justice for all. This work will advance the emerging field of planetary health and inform public policy and action in Canada and beyond. Dr. Galway's research program will also support integration, interdisciplinary research, and intersectoral action through methodological and practical innovations. Dr. Galway is also co-leading several projects focused on climate emotions, climate justice, and climate education. The presentation today is entitled Insights and Reflections from Climate Emotions Research Across Canada. Welcome, Lindsay.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for joining. I'm just going to share my, I just have to, it says disabled screen sharing, so you can just change that while I say hello to everyone. So thanks for that lovely introduction. Let's see, there we go. And just get my screen sharing going. There, wonderful. So in addition to the lovely, formal biography that you just shared, Ali, I also like to just recognize the other parts of me as a human on this planet and this community. So I'm also a mother of 3 young children. I'm a climate activist in this community. I do a lot of education, both in the community and in this institution and with public health circles around climate change and impacts on health and equity. And I'm also a contributor to climate change and someone who's working to address as much as I can in multiple ways. And so today I'm joining from the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation, and I wanted to honor elders and youth from these lands and this territory by just beginning with a short message, which is a message that has emerged from some climate change and health adaptation work that we've done, focused on intergenerational relationship building. And the message is Animki Waju Manadu Bizindaw. And that translates to listen to Thunder Mountain. Thunder Mountain is a sacred space here in the traditional territory of Fort William. So I'd like us to keep that in mind today, both in our presentation and moving forward for the rest of our days as well. So how are we spending our time together? We have about an hour. And so I'm just going to begin with a little bit of context. My suspicion is this audience may not need a whole lot of context around climate change, the climate crisis, and why it is both a health challenge and a health opportunity. But I just want to lay the groundwork a little bit before sharing about 2 recent projects focused on climate emotions in the national context here across so-called Canada. So the first is climate emotions and anxiety among young people in Canada, and the second is exploring climate emotions in rural, remote, and mid-sized communities across this nation. So I'm going to be pulling out some key findings and also some key insights. And then I'll end today by just sharing a few examples of what I refer to and I'm increasingly talking about as collective and constructive coping work in this community where I live, learn, work, and play, and across this region as well. So just a little bit of this setting the stage. So we know Canada is warming at 2 times the global average, and in the north and the far north, about 3 times the global average. We know that Canada has a shameful record when it comes to climate policies and commitments, which are not consistent with the Paris Agreement. And here is some nice visuals and some nice work from the really great organization, Climate Action Tracker, reminding us that Canada's overall rating is highly insufficient in terms of policy, in terms of our nationally determined contribution commitments, and in terms of equity and our fair share of action as well. Sometimes I like to call Canada a colossal fossil when it comes to our climate action and policies. And also we know, and there's a rapidly emerging body of evidence illustrating that climate change is a serious risk to mental and emotional health and well-being. And young people in particular have a unique positionality when it comes to both climate change and health, and of course are disproportionately impacted, yet having contributed the least to the climate crisis. So when it comes to this field of mental health and emotional health and climate change, there are a number of research and action gaps. Is certainly true in the Canadian context, but the field is also really moving quickly. It's emerging very rapidly, perhaps not as rapidly as the climate crisis itself, but the field is emerging very quickly with lots of insights and new knowledge generation happening, in particular over the last 5 to 10 years. At times, it feels hard to actually keep up with this rapidly emerging field. So the other little piece of context that I wanted to bring to mind before I share about some of this research that I've been doing is about language. Language, vocabulary is also rapidly emerging and shifting, and at times challenging and tricky. So my students that I teach to about this topic area are often asking me, what do these different words mean? They seem to overlap. I'm not sure what's what. So there is actually, I think, quite a bit of confusion around vocabulary. But this vocabulary is really important for talking about mental, emotional dimensions of climate change. And as Jennifer Atkinson, a leading researcher in this space, has shared in her podcast, Facing It, which is certainly worth checking out, she shares these feelings are there, but we ignore their legitimacy by refusing to name them. These terms help us conceptualize something that otherwise seems invisible. So these advances in language and vocabulary and concepts are really important for making this visible, in my view. So I wanted to particularly note 2 concepts that are really important in my body of research. So climate emotions and climate anxiety. So my description and definition of climate emotions, which is largely drawing on Piccola, who does a lot of work in this space, particularly on the conceptual dimensions, is feelings, emotions, and affective phenomena related to and shaped by both climate change and climate injustices. And I would argue that there's really rapidly growing acceptance around the broader relevance of climate emotions, not only for health and well-being, but also for policy, for communication, for education, for climate engagement. In some ways reflecting what one could call an affective turn in the realm of climate change broadly. And of course, climate anxiety, so many different definitions, descriptions, and also scales in the research for measuring and monitoring climate anxiety. In my work, defined as future-oriented heightened distress related to climate crisis that is characterized by a constellation of strong and interconnected emotions such as worry, fear, sadness, anger, and powerlessness. And just to remind folks that, yes, there is this limited consensus in terms of definition. This is just from a new publication from Van Dyke in just this year. This is something that I argue almost in all of my papers about the need to move forward on conceptual clarity around some of these concepts and terms. And the other note to recognize that's really important when it comes to climate anxiety, in my view anyhow, is the increasing recognition that climate anxiety is an appropriate response to where we find ourselves, to where we are at in terms of the climate crisis and the range of evidence around impacts and inequities, and not mental illness. And so that, of course, is what many important organizations, the APA, for example, are increasingly putting forward in their work as well. And there's a whole set of other terms and words and vocabulary, so solastalgia, ecological grief, climate grief, earth emotions, and broadly, what I want to just keep in mind is that the need for greater conceptual clarity and understanding across these. And for folks who are interested in these vocabulary dimensions, this book is really quite a nice read, Earth Emotions, Glenn Albrecht, published in 2019. So I'll recommend that read for anyone who's interested in these dimensions. Okay, so moving on now to the first research and publication that I wanted to speak to, which is, sounds like someone's not on mute, which is fine by me, but Ali, maybe you can have a quick look there to see if we can get everyone on mute. So the first project, Climate Emotions and Anxiety Among Young People in Canada. So this is a national survey, and also, I think importantly, a call to action, particularly oriented to our federal government. Very much inspired by an influential paper published in 2021 by Hickman and al. This was a global study with 10 nations included. Canada was not one of the countries that was included in this paper. And so my colleague and I, who's a leader in the field of climate education, particularly in Canada, we thought it would be really a nice contribution to the literature and to practice realms as well, to replicate and expand on this work from Hickman and al. With a focus on Canada. So that was a big inspiration for us. But also a huge inspiration for me and also Dr. Field is our work with young people. So both as educators, doing a lot of community engagement with young people, a lot of intergenerational relationship building around climate and health and climate action certainly inspired this research as well. So I'll just speak briefly about methods. And so again, this is our work was very much adapted on the methodology in the Hickman and al. Study so that we could do global comparisons, right? So we adapted and also built on Hickman and al., but replicated as much as possible and where appropriate.
No, thank you.
And so our survey was a sample size of 1,000 youth between the ages of 16 to 25 across Canada. And our data were collected in March of 2022. And it was in both French and let me see, I think I can maybe mute. There we go. That should solve that. In both official languages, so in French and English, and our data were weighted by age, gender, and region. And so we ran similar analytical processes to Hickman and al., including descriptive statistics and also 4 scales. But we also included a number of open-ended questions, which were not included in the Hickman and al. Study, particularly around coping and around youth perspectives on education and social and emotional dimensions of climate education. And for these questions, we use thematic coding to identify core themes across the data. And when I move into the findings here in a minute, you'll see a number of direct quotes. And this is not from the survey research itself, but another study, in some ways a parallel study by one of my master's students, Ainsley Klassen. And you can see the publication name there if folks want to go look at that paper. But I wanted to include some quotes as I'm speaking and moving through some of these key findings from the survey data to bring to life and bring more voice from young people in relation to these findings. Now, of course, the set of limitations to just flag and keep in mind as we're thinking about the findings, insights, and their relevance. So this is, of course, cross-sectional design, not capturing trends here in any way. I think capturing and starting to understand trends is going to be really important moving forward in this field of research. Self-reported data, of course, in this survey. I think it's also important to recognize that myself and Dr. Field are white adult scholars, and so the data, the findings are interpreted and described, particularly in the paper, from our perspective. Our future research in this field will be working much more closely with young people to both design and collect and analyze data. And our findings are not generalizable to younger, below age 16. So we use the 16 to 25 age category or age range to align with the Hickman and al. Study. But many youth groups that we have done some knowledge mobilization work since, have really encouraged us to do some more research with both younger groups and also older groups. So to keep in mind that these findings may not be generalizable to younger or older age range beyond the data collected. And I also wanted to just flag, so in our survey instrument, which is available online with the paper itself, we focused on the federal governments, and the reason we did that was for specificity and also so we could make a strong call to action in our outputs. But of course, when we're thinking about climate action and also how action intersects with climate emotions, all levels of government, certainly municipal and provincial and federal in the Canadian context, are influential and relevant and important to consider, but not captured in these data. Okay, so now I want to move into just pulling out some of the key findings here, and then I'll share some core insights. So first of all, we see very clearly that young people across this country are experiencing a range of what I like to call challenging climate emotions and experiencing these emotions at high levels. So we asked, does climate change make you feel any of the following? And you can see here, and I've put this little flag here, these emotions of fear, sadness, anxiousness, helplessness, powerlessness, and anger. Very common. And these are, if we think back to how I'm thinking about, and many others are defining climate anxiety, these as central emotions to the experience of climate anxiety. And I also, it was interesting in these data, and the survey data, grief was reported by about 3 in 10 survey respondents. And interestingly, in some of the other one that I'll share later today and some other interview-based research that we've done, we see grief emerging much more fully and in much more complex ways when sharing through stories, through conversations and interviews, and also arts-based processes. So this is just something that I think is quite interesting to keep in mind and thinking about future research as well. And just to share from the words of some young people themselves. So here's Elizabeth, age 21. I feel like there's nothing I can do. It's like you're taking 1 teaspoon out of an ocean and thinking you're doing something, but you aren't. Or Catherine, age 19, anxiety is something that comes back to gnaw at the forefront of my brain during most daily excursions. So another key finding, climate change is impacting the daily functioning as well as overall mental health of young people. So I want you all to think about, 10 young adults, young people in your lives. And so 8 and 10 report impacts on their overall mental health. And so we know that broadly, there are many other factors and forces at play leading to trends in overall declining mental health generally across this country. And these data and other data, of course, are suggesting that climate change is one of these contributing factors to these overall trends. And if, again, we think about these 10 young people, 4 report at least moderate impacts on their daily life. So we see this expressed by Sophia. I'll go from having a lot of energy and feeling really passionate to not being able to get out of bed some days because I'm so worried. And of course, here she's speaking about climate change specifically. Now, again, thinking about climate anxiety, which of course is characterized by negative future-oriented thinking. So we asked a set of questions to get a sense of future-oriented thinking from the perspective of young people across Canada. So we asked, does climate change make you think any of the following? And so we can see on questions like the future is frightening, people had failed to take care of the planet. Approximately 70% of respondents are answering yes. And interestingly, this question here at the bottom of the slide, I'm hesitant to have children. So we're seeing this in a range of other studies. And I write here, stay tuned. This is another project, which we're currently in the data near the end phase of our data analysis, where we've conducted about 42 interviews or so with young people who are considering not having children due to the climate crisis. And so we've conducted interviews to start to learn more about decision-making and connections to climate emotions when thinking about having or not having children in the future. So stay tuned for that research in the near future. We also asked a range of questions to get a sense of both perspectives on and feelings about federal government action, or I would say inaction on climate change, and young people I think would agree. So nearly 60% report feeling not at all or a little valued or protected by the current, or at the time in 2022, federal government action in response to climate change. And 60% do not think the government is doing enough to respond to the climate crisis and to avert catastrophe, was the language in the survey itself. That said, there is, glimmers of hope from the perspective of young people. So we asked, do you agree with this statement? I believe that together we can do something about the climate threat. And about 70% believe that when working together, we can address the climate crisis, and about half believe that they have a role to play. So one of the ways in which we expanded on the Hickman and Al study was asking about coping and also education, as I mentioned before. And so we asked, and this was an open-ended question, we wanted to get a general sense here and a broad sense of programs, supports, and resources to help young people cope with climate emotions. And again, so we analyzed these using thematic analysis. And so the most common emergent themes were firstly seeking emotional and mental health support with and from others. So this included examples like talking with friends and family and support groups around climate change. And also another important theme, engaging an individual level and also collective climate action, and also seeking formal education initiatives and programs. Less common, but still important themes in the data here were managing feelings and emotions through a range of activities. This included things like getting out into nature, more sort of traditional coping strategies broadly, and also seeking out solutions through informal learning activities, and finally, shifting perceptions and positive thinking and hope. So what's interesting about these themes that have emerged is they do illustrate alignment with what's emerging or what others are using in the literature, this sort of three-pronged framework around coping. So problem, emotion, and meaning-focused coping. And so Maria Ohala has done some really nice work around that in the context of Nordic countries and Europe, and with youth in particular. So there's a lot of media interest around this study after it was first published. And one of the things that media like to ask is what surprised you from your research or your findings. And this is what I often shared that was somewhat surprising to me. So we asked about the extent to which young people are talking to others about climate change and sort of what happens when they do. And 1/3 of participants are not talking to others about climate change and the climate emotions, and another third when they do feel ignored or dismissed. And so I think this is really important when we think about what we should be doing to support coping and to support young people broadly around climate emotions. And the last key finding I wanted to share with you all today is related to this dimension of climate emotion that we asked a number of questions about. And so broadly, we hear quite strongly from young people that they believe the formal education system should be doing more to teach them about climate change. So climate change curricula across the country, both at a range of levels, is really lacking. So there's some great research from Dr. Ellen Field around this broadly. So young people agree that there's not enough education around climate change in the formal education system. And they're also telling us that they think climate education should be integrating and focusing more on the social and emotional dimensions of climate change education. Of course, educators, I have a couple of students who are doing research around this dimension in the education program. And so educators are saying they need support, resources, time to do this well. And of course, this is often lacking in the formal education systems. And so young people also shared through an open-ended question specific ideas about how the formal education system can support mental and emotional health in the face of climate change. And so this included increasing climate change content in schools, but in particular, teaching and education focused on solutions. I think this is really, really important, and I integrate this in many ways into my education in the university level around climate change broadly and climate and health as well. And also young people asking for mental health supports within the education system. So those are some of the key findings from that particular project I wanted to share. So the paper itself has more data and more findings for those who are interested to learn a bit more from the young people across this nation and their perspectives and experiences of climate emotions and climate anxiety as well. So these are the key insights that I see from these data. First of all, young people are experiencing a range of emotions around climate change, and also related very much so to government inaction. And I see alignment with these data to climate anxiety and current descriptions and definitions of climate anxiety. And I think with young people, this certainly this future-oriented negative thinking and this set of emotions, but also this sense and feeling of powerlessness is particularly relevant for young people and our understanding of experiences of climate anxiety. So in many ways, the data across Canada align globally with the data and the findings from Hickman and al., particularly with sort of more comparable nations, Canada, Northern Europe, and Australia. And so I speak a little bit more about this in the paper for folks who want to learn more about that as well. And perhaps most importantly is this dimension of adult inaction. And so, writ large, climate action is essential to protect and promote mental and emotional health of young people. And this is something that I recently did a presentation for the ECCC, so Environment and Climate Change Canada, and I said this very clearly to a whole bunch of research scientists and policymakers, and read this quote actually. So I thought I would read it here today. Which is, it is essential to recognize that young Canadians are experiencing distress and mental health consequences because of the failures of adults, decision makers, and governments to adequately address the climate crisis. And echoing the voices and perspectives of young Canadians, we call for urgent and transformative climate action to protect the mental and emotional health of young people. And surprisingly, the research scientists and policymakers at ECCC, took this message received this message well. Of course, yet to see policy change or action, but was well received in the discussion that followed the particular presentation. So I suspect that many folks here today, or perhaps are listening to this recordings, would think of themselves or are working towards youth allyship, many as educators, parents, those who have young people in their lives. And so I wanted to pull out a couple of recommendations that I think are particularly important to keep in mind in terms of youth, working with youth, supporting youth, and working towards youth allyship. And the first is the real necessity to listen, to recognize and validate climate emotions. And I'll be speaking a little bit more about this when I share about the next research project as well. A real necessity for solutions-oriented education. We heard that very clearly from the young people who participated in this research, in this survey. And for those of us who are engaging in climate education, I think we also have a responsibility to check in, to recognize, validate, and process often our own emotional dimensions as we do the work of solutions-oriented education. There's a real need, and we're seeing this, emerge in a number of different ways, a number of exciting and inspiring ways. And I myself and my colleagues have also been doing this kind of work here, and I'll share about that at the end of my presentation today. But the real imperative of creating accessible, creating safe spaces to do this work of validating, recognizing, sharing, and processing, given what we see in these data and what we're hearing from young people in other ways, in other spaces as well. And recognizing the centrality of this powerlessness, of course, a real important path in creating pathways for involving young people in decision-making around their future broadly, and of course, in related to climate action and policy specifically. And I just wanted to name, before sharing about the next research project, that this research received a lot of media attention, and I suspected that it would. And that was, again, one of the inspirations for this work as well, to help to share some of this work through media outlets. And so I think there was something like 40 or so news reports after this paper was published. And this research and other research and other data as well is currently supporting legal action in the province of Saskatchewan, where a group of residents in that province are taking the Sask Power to court in relation to their inaction on making progress towards net zero by 2050. So just underscoring the relevance of these kind of data and this research specifically. So the other project that I wanted to share. So Ali, I'm just receiving a note here. It says your free meeting will end in 10 minutes. So not sure if there's anything you can do on your end to address that, but maybe I'll try to be really quick in case we get kicked out of our meeting in 10 minutes. So the second project that I wanted to share is called Exploring Climate Emotions in Rural, Remote, and Mid-sized Communities. And so this was really to get a sense of lived experiences of climate emotions, and particularly in this rural, remote, mid-sized city context. And so we used interviews, and we used a rather unique and I think relevant letter writing process here, and we had a sample of 28 participants in this research, 16 years of older, and we recruited specifically across Canada's 5 major biomes, and we were doing so to represent sort of a broader diversity of climate hazards and ecosystems, and also political dimensions as well. And so I think I'll just dive into some of the key findings from our analytical work. So we use a thematic network analysis, which is a emergent thematic coding process, which works towards identifying global, organizing, and basic themes. And so you can see there on the bottom of your screen in the gray circles is the 3 main global themes that emerge from our analysis. So complex, intense, and challenging climate emotions, factors shaping climate emotions, and also consequences of climate emotions. And so I'm going to just go through each of those and sharing some of the voice of our participants in relation to these. So when we're thinking about this global theme of complex, intense, and challenging climate emotions, one of the core organizing themes here was around climate emotions and emotion. What I'm talking about is emotional constellations. So we see a lot of overlap in these data and some other survey data and other research broadly around common emotions. So of course, anger, worry, frustration, fear, sadness, powerlessness emerged throughout our interviews and letters and conversations. And one of the intriguing dimensions was this notion of emotional constellations. And so I'm using this concept or this thinking to describe these clusters of emotions, which tend to be, and were frequently in our data, described and discussed together. So this included specifically anxiety, fear, sadness, anxiety, powerless, and frustration, and anxiety, frustration, and sadness. And so you can see Mariah, who explained this very directly, as a story arc that often starts with anxiety, moving through frustration and then to sadness. And the other piece, and this I think is actually one of the most interesting to me dimensions of this work, and I think relevant contributions to the research. I should say that we have a paper that's just under review right now from these data. So hopefully that will be available open access shortly. But this notion of affective dilemmas. And so this really speaks to this complexity around climate emotions, which really characterize, this emerged so clearly in our interviews and our letter, this complexity and these affective dilemmas, which characterize the lived experiences of climate emotions. And so there were three affective dilemmas that emerged in our data. The first, which was very common, very prevalent, was not wanting to burden others with emotions, while at the same time wanting to talk about it. And so I think easy example or illustrative example is this is probably half of the participants would express, so I myself did the majority of the interviews along with a research assistant, but would express not wanting to share or give or burden me as the interviewer with emotions. But then as we move through the conversations and very often at the end, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to share and express their experiences and an opportunity to talk about their their climate emotions. And so Spencer summarized this really nicely. But it's hard to talk with friends about it. And when he says it here, he's referring to a range of emotions, because you don't want to bum your friends out. You don't want to be like, oh, let's get together and talk about the saddest thing we can think of. So you try not to, even though you kind of want to, because it's on your mind all the time. So so again, Spencer summarizes very nicely, but we saw this very commonly across our interviews and also within letters as well. So the second affective dilemma, was this rather general questioning around validity of emotions related to climate change, around appropriateness of specific emotions or just general emotional impacts or responses. And so here's Emerson speaking around anxiety specifically and climate anxiety, his experiences of climate anxiety. So we are told all the time that anxiety is irrational. It's our body's response to things that no longer are a danger to us, but it's like this thing, climate change is something that is very real. And so it's kind of like, is this anxiety? Is it rational? And then after I remember a long pause in this interview, Emerson then went on to say, in this case, it's rational, I think. And this, as I noted earlier, is emerging in both the research space and the practice world, recognizing that climate anxiety in particular is a rational and appropriate response. So the second global themes was a range of factors giving rise and giving shape to climate emotions. So I'm going to move through most of them rather quickly here, but then share a little bit of the specifics on place, because this, perhaps it's a bias of mine, but I think this is also a unique and novel contribution from this work. And so identities and privilege certainly giving rise and shape to lived experiences of climate emotions. So age, race, gender, and privilege in particular. And these really are intersecting and intersectional. So we argue that others are doing as well for the value and benefit of intersectional lens and approach when considering and doing research and also responding to climate emotions. So all participants described a sense of responsibility and concern for future generations as central to shaping climate emotions. This often was with respect to their own children, grandchildren, young people that folks work with or care deeply about. So a general sense of responsibility to protect the well-being of future generations, and also a real sense of concern and a range of emotions associated with this concern for children and future generations broadly. There's also one of our organizing themes is not enough action. And so this really was reflected at both individual and systemic levels. So many participants questioning their own engagement and questioning enoughness around engagement with climate action at an individual level, and also a range of emotions associated with that, often guilt, frustration, and powerlessness in particular. And also this important notion of inadequate action from those in positions of power, most commonly related to the specific emotions of powerlessness and frustration as well. Also, clearly, this is no surprise, and this is often written about in other research and in other spaces as well. Certainly experiencing, bearing witness to, and learning about climate impacts and climate inequities gives rise and shape to experiences of climate emotions. And so in our data, this was described through experiences of a range of extreme events. This depended on the community and the context participants reside in, and the places with the context within which they're experiencing these extreme events. Also, some descriptions less common, but certainly within the data around the gradual climate change, gradual changes emerging through climate change, and those ways in which those changes are also giving rise to emotional impacts and responses. And then also important what we talk about as vicarious experiences. So that includes in particular learning about climate change largely through educational, formal and informal spaces, and as well social media and other and media broadly. And so lastly, this last organizing theme here is place. And this to me was really quite intriguing and very prevalent and important in the data in both the interviews and the letters. And so the two basic themes here are connections with nature and climate of science. And so Anna sums it up really nicely, very to the point. I think nature ties into all these emotions. And then Anna went on, I recall this interview as well, to describe the ways in which her deep sense of connectedness with place and nature in her community really gave rise to her specific climate emotions. And often this also gave rise to things like anger, fear, sadness, sense of loss, and grief. But for some, this was not as common as those emotions that I just spoke to. But for some, a sense of connection with land and nature also gave rise to emotions like hope and wonder and awe, which also I think is really interesting and intriguing to think through. And the second piece here related to place, and that I think is particularly relevant when thinking about the rural, remote, and mid-sized community contexts here is what we talk about as a climate of silence. And so Morgan shares where I live in Saskatchewan. Morgan is from a rural community in Saskatchewan. There's not much support here for talking about emotions and climate change. Or Avery, sometimes I feel like I'm the only one in this community who is feeling so deeply. Why am I so devastated by this? And so interestingly, 3 or perhaps it was 4 participants actually expressed that they had previously lived in a larger urban city or context, and then having moved to a rural remote community, really experiencing a change and a more impactful presence of this climate of silence around climate emotions in this rural remote context in particular. So the last global theme highlights the consequential nature of climate emotions. So again, climate emotions are appropriate, valid responses to the climate crisis and inequities associated with the climate crisis. Climate anxiety is not pathological, but climate emotions, and our data certainly illustrate this, are consequential. And we're seeing this emerge, and our data illustrate this through the organizing themes of life decisions and inaction. So for example, choosing not to have children, lifestyle choices, folks moving to different communities where they have a sense that they might be able to engage in climate action more fully, and also impacts on relationships, for example. And then finally, embodiment, health, and well-being. I was surprised at the extent to which participants described this embodiment. And so Riley and Benjamin express this in these quotes here. Mariah and Benjamin. So it gets to a point where I'm just like, I can't breathe. So this impacts on breathing was actually quite common. Like, I just have a heaviness on my chest. Or Benjamin, when I start to get worked up or I think about this for too much time, I feel it like physically, like my chest is tight. It's a real physical manifestation of fear and anxiety. And it's hard to explain to people because people just think you're nuts. So that's Benjamin's description of that embodiment. And of course, nearly all participants described ways in which climate emotions that they were experiencing were affecting their overall mental health and well-being. So Lennon, it's a huge impact on me mentally. I think about it all the time. And Maxine, who shared, it is really hard to live with. It's really hard because I'm always facing this crisis. And yeah, I'm really stressed. My body is stressed. My mind is stressed. So we saw this in a number of different ways. And so Lennon and Maxine shared this explicitly here. So I'm just going to wrap up here by sharing a few of the insights relevant or that I think have emerged from this particular research, which there's, of course, some alignment with the project that I described before and other work that I'm doing in the broader field of research as well. So first, to just highlight that climate emotions are characteristically complex. They're dynamic and interconnected, and they are shaped by, myriad factors, as we see in these data very clearly. We also see for many, climate emotions are intense and consequential, and at times overwhelming. I think these data certainly underscore the importance that I noted before around creating accessible and safe spaces for validating, recognizing, and processing climate emotions. And this task that I think we should all take up around breaking the climate of silence around emotional dimensions of the climate crisis and climate emotions and our experiences of those. And I think these data also highlight the place-based and nature-based programs and initiatives to support coping are an important area to explore and to support moving forward. And as I shared, I'm just going to spend the last few minutes speaking directly to coping. And as I said, my focus specifically on collective and constructive coping. And so we've just, myself and a set of colleagues and knowledge users have just been awarded an Insight grant through SSHRC. So this is a 4-year project where we'll be focusing on synthesizing, generating, and mobilizing knowledge on climate anxiety and coping, with a focus on youth and young adults across Canada and oriented to collective and constructive coping. So we're just getting started on this. We've just received these funds, and we'll be really diving in the fall. So happy or looking forward to moving forward with this research focus more specifically on collective and constructive coping. And we've been doing some of this kind of work in this community and in this region. And so before we open up for Q&A, I'll just briefly, a very quick taster of some of this work that we've been doing. So one example is something called Climate Emotion Circle. So we've been doing this with university students in a few different ways, where we're creating those safe, accessible spaces for university students to come together to gather. We've done this both online, hybrid, and in place in more land-based processes to share, process, validate climate emotions collectively. We've received a lot of positive feedback about these emotion circles, so something we hope to continue to do next year as well. We've also been using a range of arts-based and arts-integrated processes. So this is just one example. This was from a couple of years ago, but this was a workshop where we hosted, it was called Postcards for Climate Action. So we worked with a land-based artist who facilitated a postcard making process. And within that art integrated process, where we co-created these postcards and then mailed them to people in our lives and decision makers, we also layered in and integrated processes for talking about climate emotions specifically. So while engaging and co-creating together, integrating pathways and processes for sharing around climate emotions. Again, this was with youth and also university students. Another nice example, and this is a project that I have really loved doing. We've done four now, climate action field schools. So this is an intensive education-oriented opportunity and intensive field school experience where we are very focused on solutions in relation to climate education, and also throughout the field school process have integrated a number of practices and processes for doing this work of recognizing, validating, and processing climate emotions in collective and constructive ways. And the last is work that we've done with Fort William First Nation and the Mountain Keepers Youth Group, and also elders in this community. Again, this is an arts integrated process where we worked with a land-based artist again to co-create art, and through that process engage in conversations around climate action and responsibilities in particular in this case. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. So we have about 15 minutes or so for discussion or any questions. So I'll pass back to Ali to open up for conversation and perhaps navigate any questions that come up.
Great, fantastic. Thanks so much, Lindsay. That was a great presentation. Are there any questions from the audience, either in the chat or you feel free to put your hand up? Oh, okay. Gina, go out for it.
Hi, thanks. That was a wonderful presentation, and I really appreciated, I think it's such a stickiness around how we talk about these emotions, and I think you did such a beautiful job in doing it in a really clear way while acknowledging sort of that trickiness there. So I found that really inspirational. My question is around the grief piece, because we've been doing some work with young people where we got them to look at some survey questions. And what we found with our younger folks, so mostly 13 to 15, is when we presented them with like the grief question kind of in that checklist, that we ended up having a lot of questions about what it means. So just issues around like comprehension. So what we ended up doing was dropping it from our survey, which was going out to younger folks, because we just weren't certain how it would be interpreted. We were sad to do it because we think it's such an important emotion, but we just weren't certain how it would be interpreted. But then you were talking about how it was coming up more in stories. So I'm just wondering if you have any reflections. This is something I've been thinking about around how can we kind of get at that without using it in that kind of checklist style. It just doesn't maybe resonate, but it's still allowing for space for these types of emotions to come through in a way that young people understand them, rather than sort of using more adult laden language. So just interested in your perspectives, particularly around like that storytelling piece that you were talking about.
Yeah, excellent question. I've been thinking so much about these dimensions too. So it's so lovely to have an opportunity to chat a bit with folks who are sort of navigating these complexities as well. So I guess part of it to me is, okay, first of all, I think we need a range of research methodologies, given the complexity here, given that this field is rather new, given the lack of conceptual clarity or the challenges in the vocabulary and all of that we spoke about before. But it was so, as I mentioned, there's a number of other projects that are ongoing in this space as well. And so you may want to check out the paper. So my student Ainsley Klassen and I was co-author as well. But and we also use interviews and also letters in that as well with young. We referred to them and they referred to themselves as climate champions in their communities. And we were really intrigued to see that grief, in particular this anticipatory grief, emerged in particular through the letters. It's almost like, I think there may be some comprehension dimensions, but there may also be some particularly powerful influence of this constructed silence around grief in particular, perhaps in particular with young people. So thinking through, like, I'm really excited about research and data and processes that can create those spaces to learn and share about those, because I'm not sure that surveys are the best data collection approach, right? So I'm really excited to see how this unfolds. And I think stories and storytelling, land-based processes and arts integrated processes may be most generative. But I think we need more work in this area to have a better sense. Yeah, I'd love to chat more or brainstorm you.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was a really great answer. It gave me a lot to think about as well.
Karen, I see a hand up there.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I saw the word grief, well, just kind of my background, I'm working at a hospice, and I've been for 10 years working in bereavement with children and youth. I guess, what I thought when I saw the word grief is that all the feelings that were at the top, they are all part of what grief is. So,
yes.
So people are identifying individual feelings that really encompass the whole experience of grief,
Yeah. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, so go ahead. Sorry.
No, sorry. Did you have a question to follow or just a comment?
No, respond to that. And then I did have one other thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree. And so this is one of the things I've been trying to do in some of my work, to work towards language that is explicitly helping us recognize this interconnected piece. So I've been experimenting with constellations. One of the reasons I like that is because I think it connects us to the natural world, that language. It also helps maybe bring to mind that the specific emotional dimensions in relation to all of this will depend on who you are, your lived experiences, your positionality, etc. So they're not all the same, and that they are interconnected. So I hope that we, as a group, can continue to work towards the concepts and vocabulary that can help us understand that these are not isolated emotions, but are rather really these complex clusters that are dynamic, that are interconnected, and that are shaped by place and context and histories and future thoughts and all of these dimensions. Thank
you. And the second thing was, just as a music therapist, I'm curious if you've been using music at all to help youth get in touch with their emotions.
I have not personally, but there's a previous student that I've worked with who's now training I think it's called Safe and Sound. Does that sound familiar to you, Karen? Yeah, and so working in sort of social workspaces, but we've been having some conversations about how that does connect to this, and in some of the work some of those little practices and processes I mentioned in the work around collective and constructive coping, so the climate emotion circles and the arts-based postcards for climate action pieces, we always do have music or sounds integrated into that. So yeah, that's an important reminder, because I think it's really important and essential, but I haven't been very explicit about that. So thanks for bringing that up. Appreciate that.
And a question from Kiffer.
Yeah, I think it's kind of what comes to mind with this conversation around grief. I think it's particularly around this idea of like anticipatory grief, which has had like this long kind of jaded history in psychology as to whether or not it even exists. Can you experience like grief before something? And but it like makes me think of the phases of grief that people experience, and that those as themselves really actually capture the anger, denial, like it captures a lot of the ways people do respond, and the sense of like powerlessness
Yeah.
that you kind of highlight in your work, which I think is really important to kind of the whole mess. And so, I wonder if you have any thoughts in thinking about like, when thinking about these constellation of like, I guess, how do you methodologically think about like grouping constellations, right? Or grouping emotions? Because like Ekman's work around emotional classification, right? He's like, oh, 6 and that's it, and so it's like, I guess just how do you grapple with the classification, particularly when thinking about climate emotions, but also like the ways in which all these things really are somehow an underlying basic human process that really doesn't belong to categories. And so maybe also a bit about around the utility of are these really useful, and to what extent and how are they useful, I think is another maybe sub question. But how do you do it, and then why maybe?
Yeah, the methodological question is really interesting. So I gained as a researcher much more from the interviews, and as I said, I have 3 or 4 projects underway right now using interviews and letters and a range of other processes. And so that is really helping me understand this complexity compared to some of the work around more quantitative data where we need to have rigor, have the boxes that are pretty defined and distinct, and right. And so I think there are others out there that are going to keep working on that realm, figuring out how things hang together, for whom and where. I think the where piece we can't forget, we often do. And so I don't think that's an area I'm going to focus on moving forward, because I'm really oriented on what to do and how to address where we're, these experiences and these lived emotions. And I think I get more guidance from methodologies that are rooted in story, conversation, and arts, compared to things like survey. I think the survey pieces were really important. This is a tangent, but like I said, the media just keeps also grabbing onto that, that paper and those data, because it's easy to say, it's easy to share, it's the little few data points. So there's absolutely, we need to continue developing in that realm, but I don't think where I'm going to be focusing my energy, and anyway, so that's some of my just reflections on that. And then also around grief and loss and anticipatory dimensions. So we also saw very clearly in the data, this is with young people, but also, the paper the research I described here today, there's also these tensions with the tangible and intangible. So particularly with young people, it is these intangible pieces. So sense of safety, the vision of what they expect their life to be, sense of security. Those are mainly the sources, the losses that are described and shared. Compared to when we hear from other generations, particular older generations, we did see different kinds of loss experiences and grief described in more tangible ways. And of course, this question of grief and loss, I think, is really, really important moving forward, given what's going on at the international realm with loss and damages. And so what we consider loss, what we consider tangible and intangible in those different dimensions, I think there's, lots of really important questions in there. And I think it will be really interesting to see what our role is as researchers and practitioners in that space as it continues to unfold. Early days, I think. Not sure if that was a good answer. I kind of rambled for a little bit. There's lots of things there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thanks for your presentation. It was really, really wonderful to hear you present on these data.
And I think that I saw a hand up before, but maybe, I'm not sure.
I did have my hand up, but I know we're just about out of time, and I have to run to another meeting in 30 seconds. So thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I have lots of questions and lots of thoughts, and I follow up with you offline to chat more.
Yeah, that would be lovely. And just, broadly, given this work that myself and some colleagues are working towards over the next number of years through this Insight grant around constructive and collective coping. So one of the things we're going to be doing is learning from folks who are working towards supporting coping with young people and various processes and pulling out what's working, what's not, insights and learnings broadly through a range of processes. So folks who are doing that work or have colleagues who are doing that work would love to, make connections there.
Great. And with that, I think we're at time. Lindsay, thank you, or Dr. Galway, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. My apologies for the tech issues. And thanks again for your time and good luck with all your research.
Thanks, no problem. I just saw the message now, Kiffer, to ask about co-host changing or whatever. Sorry, I didn't see that pop up, but seems like we had it resolved anyhow. Okay, great.
Awesome.
All right, thanks so much. And hope to connect with some of you soon.
Okay, be well, everybody.